All right, welcome everyone. I want to thank you for attending today's Zen Talk. For those of you who might be new to Zen Talks, first of all, I'm Julie Langenkamp. I'm Product Marketing Manager at ZenOptics, and we started this series of less formal webinars as a way to connect people with various different industry experts that we have the pleasure of working with. And so we pick a theme, and then we do a series of 3 webinars. Short webinars that are more conversational in style. And we are really pleased from ZenOptics to be able to welcome Donald Farmer today as our guest industry expert. Our internal industry expert is Heena Sood. And so by way of introduction, Donald has been internationally respected as a speaker, as an innovator, as a technologist, various different roles over his career that have led to important moves forward for BI and analytics. And now he is a consultant and strategist. As our topic today would imply, he is an expert in governance as well. So he consults with organization and leads them in driving their programs forward with analytics, data, business intelligence, and governance maturity. And Heena Sood is our CTO and co-founder. She leads all of the product development or all of the product-related elements within ZenOptics. And she also works very, very closely with our customers. So in addition to having the product background and the insight about what we're driving and what our vision is for ZenOptics platform, she also knows firsthand how our customers and partners are using the platform and what that looks like and what each of the customers is trying to drive for their initiatives. So Heena today will talk about what we've experienced with different customers and what that looks like in the platform. And so to recap this series that we're doing, it's all on the concept of analytics governance maturity. That's our theme. Last month, we looked at maturity models for analytics governance, assessing the maturity. Where is your organization and what does it look like to have a mature analytics governance program? Today, we're going to be talking about, okay, so we talked about where you are. How do you move the ball forward? How do you advance your analytics governance within your organization? So we'll look at what that means, what the important key considerations are. And then we're excited in January to also be able to talk about real world examples and use cases, dive in a little bit deeper to what it looks like really in practice at various different organizations. And so we'll be sharing examples for that too. So that's January 9th. But in case you missed the November session, I would love to ask Donald to just recap a little bit of the last session. It was, what does analytics maturity look like? What is analytics governance? When we talk about that, what are we even talking about? So I will hand it over to you, Donald. Thank you again for joining us. And if you wouldn't mind setting the stage, we'd love that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be doing another one of these talks. So let's deal with the question of analytics governance first. Well, we talk a lot in our industry about data governance, about governing data, about managing data, and there's entire kind of practice that goes around that. And one of the challenges is with modern analytics is that governing data actually isn't enough. We also have to be able to govern the usage of data. In other words, the same data set can be used for different purposes, and some of those purposes may be allowed, like you may give your permission for your personal data to be used for marketing, but you may not allow your personal data to be used for example, sales purposes. So, or you may allow it to be used for research and not for marketing, and so on. You get all these different choices whenever you go on a website now. You get all these different kind of choices of how your data could be used. So there's actually not just there's a very practical requirement to govern the usage of data, and that means often governing the analytics. But there's also this idea that analytics are a really important part of our decision-making process, and therefore we have to be able to audit and manage the process of making decisions, and looking at the analysis behind them is a very important part of that. So analytics governance is this process that kind of takes over from where data governance stops. Data governance is concerned with the data that feeds into analytics, but now for exactly the same reasons, you need to govern your analytics. Now, when we talked about maturity and what that looked like, how do you advance in analytic governance maturity? One of the key things is this question of processes and policies. When we start out in analytics, very often we start out in self-service analytics. Very often we start out with a small number of individuals doing analytics within an organization. And that's a pretty much not only an ungoverned process, but there's very few policies, very few prescriptive practices built around that. As organizations mature and as the analytics within the organization matures, we get more and more concern about the policies and the practices that are applied to the analytics. You start to get analytics teams developing. You start to get an analytics organization. You'll start to get concern about analytics policies. So as you mature, you're seeing the organization of analytics, you're seeing the policies that govern analytics, and you're seeing the practice of analytics become more prescriptive rather than ad hoc, with a certain amount of kind of predetermined practices around these, which ensure that analytics is performed by the right people at the right time in the right way. And that's why we can say that we're getting mature at that point.
Heena, is there anything that from a technology from your perspective, and so thank you, Donald, for that, and looking comprehensively at the big picture. Is there anything you want to drill down on, Heena, from the ZenOptics perspective?
Well, I just want to add, and I think, thank you for I'm glad to be back here again and looking forward to this conversation. But just to reiterate what Donald said, I think in a lot of our conversations, we all know about the data governance aspect and the fact that it has been really sort of become mainstream. And, it's a very bottoms-up approach at looking at sort of, your data going upward. And analytics governance is really that top-down view, right? And so I think it's the combination of the two that's super critical, especially because self-service analytics has given us the capability and the ability, the maturity to really drive innovation with analytics in terms of how people are using it, in terms of making it available at the right time for the right use. But it's sort of been, it's very widespread and uncontrolled. And so it's sort of almost like having the guardrails, right, to manage that. And so that's what analytics governance provides, is those bumpers to make sure that you're sort of sticking and you're following and also building the policies and the processes, right? So the maturity around that journey is what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to hand it back to Donald to talk about how do we mature? How do organizations mature in their analytics governance journey?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very important point, actually, is that the process of maturing involves developing along all these three axes: the people axis, the processes axis, and the technology axis. And there's a couple of things that I often see in organizations as they develop along these kind of dimensions. And one of them is that, as I hinted at earlier, they actually develop organizations. They develop formal organizations. Very often they're virtual teams who are charged with an oversight of analytics. So that's one of the important things about maturity. Somebody has responsibility for analytics governance. It's not just something which happens. People have to have it as job description. They have to have goals. They have to have KPIs around it in order to make it happen. So, they often say that you can't manage what you don't measure. So you have to have measures of governance built around these things. So there's that kind of people side, and the process side, of course, inevitably goes along with that. And then there's also the adoption of specific technologies, which does get super interesting. And of course, ZenOptics is the leading technology in that space that enables a set of tools for applying these policies and applying these organizational methods. So I think it's really important that we think of these three dimensions of maturity developing together, and that there's a formal aspect to them. There's a point at which a business will sit down and say, we need to be prescriptive about this. Let's set up an organization, which is the human part. Let's give this organization something to do, which is the process part, and they need the tools in order to do that. And that may start out just as an extension of data governance, but very quickly you have to add specialized analytics governance tools, particularly because the variety of tools that are used in analytics is so wide. The same data set can be accessed by many, many different applications, ranging from spreadsheets to full-blown advanced analytics applications with enterprise reporting in between there somewhere. So you need to move people forward organizationally. Inevitably, that involves adding processes, but at some point you need to adopt a technology, because it's only a technology that actually gives these teams the oversight and insight that they need. So I think that's an important part of the process.
So
yeah. Go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, so we talked about the teams. What does it look like to build an analytics governance team? Who should be involved, and what are the roles? What are the key considerations that are important for the people aspect of formalizing that team and those roles and responsibilities?
Well, I certainly have my own view of this, and let's see if Heena agrees with me. But I think it's really critical that we have a balance of both IT and business in any sort of governance team, because in the long run, this is not purely a technical problem. There's a business element to this as well. So you don't want restrictions. Analytics is such an important part of modern business. It's really what makes the difference. I think Alan Weber, the founder of Fast Company magazine, once said that in the information economy, in the new economy, he said conversations are the most important form of work. And he didn't really mean just hanging around a water cooler chatting. He meant, it's not just about the information. We all have more information than we've ever had before. The real difference is what we do with it. And that involves conversations and decision making. And so, you don't want to restrict that too much. You don't want to clamp down on people analyzing data, browsing data, making decisions with data. You want to enable them to do that. So there has to be in any governance team or any governance organization, business has to be really well represented, because you can't expect IT to understand all the potential business scenarios that analytics can cover. So IT have to be part of it, because there's a technical element to the governance, and there's simple questions about how you actually apply some of the policies that you want. But you must have business as well. So it's really important to find a balance of business and IT. Personally, I mean, I'm kind of got a technical background, so I tend to be a little bit towards the IT side inevitably, because that's where I've done a lot of my work. But I'm always going to have this one eye open to the business input to this process. What do you think, Heena?
Well, yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. And I think the way we look at it in the platform today, actually, just naturally provides that capability for a collaboration between IT and business, because the process of analytics governance that is enabled through the ZenOptics platform requires a collaboration in context of, you're setting up the platform, but then what are you doing to make sure that the right information and the trusted information and the certified information is being made available? So we look at these folks as sort of information stewards, so to speak. And these information stewards are typically the business process owners and or the business group, the business groups or the teams that are responsible for working to deliver the content, working to actually provide the insights. And so naturally they become the stewards in the platform and become involved in that analytics governance process, because their job on a day-to-day basis is to make sure that, the right decisions, or that they're enabling folks to be able to make decisions. But now they have the capability of making sure that they can provide the right way to make the decisions, right? The right process and how to make the decisions. And on the IT side, again, the ability to have the insights into usage, into various different contexts of the governance piece is super critical, right? So there is a combination of those two roles coming together, sort of inherently in the way we look at it from a ZenOptics perspective. So spot on, I guess I would say.
And And as a point of clarification, I wanted to just elaborate a little bit on what Heena said about information stewards. That's a role that we talk about internally. And these people aren't necessarily stewards, but they're not data stewards necessarily. They are people with subject matter expertise regarding the business information or the assets that are to be promoted to others for that decision-making process. So they have enough contextual knowledge of the analytics asset, as we call it, the report, or the whatever information is necessary to be able to surface that to other business or to other users for the analysis that needs to take place. And so it is a monitoring and management and curation, and all of these elements go into that role of what we call an info steward or information steward, but it's not necessarily a formal job title within organizations. It's somebody who, and I go back to the age-old phrase of bridging the gap between business and IT. They have the business knowledge and they have the technical proficiency to be able to say, all right, this is what it should look like in order to be able to deliver these assets to the right people.
Mm-hmm.
I think right now that's a great point, that the role is often very informal, and that the information steward role is not the data steward role. But I've seen a couple of circumstances which suggest that this is changing and has to change. I've certainly seen cases where companies have discovered, often in an audit, that they have some compliance issue. And then the compliance issue turns out that it's not a data issue. The data has actually been well governed. It's been downstream of the data. And to give you one very, very simple example, which is not necessarily an analytics example, but it's a very clear one. I've worked with clients who have had client software, often on mobile devices, which wasn't closing its connections to the server on a timeout. So the connection to the server was staying open. Now, the data steward had very little control over that, and in fact, didn't necessarily even know what was happening. They certainly weren't looking at the mobile devices. As far as they were concerned, all the data access was properly governed. But way downstream, there was somebody with a mobile device, which if they'd left it such that somebody else could pick it up, they would see confidential information. So it turned out that, well, the governance at one end of the system was very good, and the governance at the other end of the system wasn't. And I've seen similar cases with people who, I think it was Rita Salam from Gartner, who once said that reporting systems have become expensive ETL products for self-service business intelligence, meaning that people would go to a report that they'd got, an enterprise report, they'd export it to Excel, and then they'd start to do work in Excel, or they'd start to do work in self-service. That seems to me exactly a problem, not of data governance, but of analytics governance. How do you control that part of the process? And yes, it's informal just now because people are starting to discover this, but it's going to become formalized. And the other part of this then is, how does this affect us? How does this affect the choice of tools? How does it affect the architecture? I think that's where it starts to get pretty interesting.
And we're starting to see that shift, Donald, for sure. We're starting to see investments in that role in some of our customers. And while it may still be informal in the title, the actual job, the actual work that they're doing is in alignment with that particular role, right? So it's a matter of sort of that transition. But I think the next slide is probably a good lead-in to that, right? What influences that transition? What influences for someone to really invest and adopt that framework of analytics governance?
And that's what I was going to say. These steward roles, regardless of how formal or informal they are, these are often people who are essential in driving the change, in driving the process change, establishing the processes across the whole span of governance, so that then, like Donald, in your example, there is visibility and course correction along the way when necessary. But there are other factors that drive process change, and these were a few that in our brainstorming for today we talked about. Donald, I'm gonna let you elaborate on these if you don't mind starting us off.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's market consolidation is the first bullet, and that's actually a really interesting thing. There are two tendencies which are affecting market consolidation, I think. One is just the economics of the market just now. analytics vendors, BI vendors are consolidating. There's been a lot of acquisitions in this space, and there's been a lot of work happening to consolidate platforms. So that's just one thing which drives it. But also there's consolidation from the consumer side, if you like, on in the enterprise side, because they are trying to rationalize the extremely diverse range of applications that they've had. The number of times you go into an enterprise and you discover that they have, 5 or 6 different reporting systems within one enterprise, or 3 or 4 different dashboard systems that they know about, not including all the self-service stuff that they may not know about. It starts to get, very obvious that they need to consolidate as well. They need to consolidate economically. They need to consolidate practically in order to do that. So there is real consolidation just now as a driving force behind all that. Another thing is the change in architecture. Increasingly, the architecture is becoming more composable and componentized, as opposed to kind of traditional, rather monolithic architectures. We used to talk about the classic kind of 3-tier architecture of the data layer and the logic layer and the presentation layer. But increasingly, developers are working with far more composable componentized systems. You see this on the data side, where people are increasingly building data pipelines and very, very agile development processes and data, which we never really had before. Data was not an agile process. Even just a few years ago, it was a very heavyweight, long sequence kind of lifestyle process. Now it's a very agile process. So that changing architecture is also driving a need for better governance of these processes. And then the other thing is, of course, the importance of policies and procedures. And that drives change in a number of ways. First of all, of course, we're increasingly seeing legislation affecting that, and we've seen that with the GDPR in Europe, and which has had a big impact not only in Europe but worldwide. We're seeing it, of course, with the individual states in the US starting to adopt, particularly in California, privacy legislation. That requires people to have policies. You just can't not have a policy. You've got to have a policy when there's legislation like that in place. So that's also driving it. So there's a lot of things happening in the market, both in terms of the economics, the legislation, and also just actually the architecture itself, the way technologies are developing. And we haven't even started getting into AI yet, which is on the horizon. So really, everything in the market is pushing in the same direction towards a need for more insight and more oversight of the processes, not just the data process, but the analytic processes that people are putting in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing it, firsthand, the need to sort of make sure that these policies and procedures are, just as an example, right? I mean, think of something like report lifecycle management, right? I mean, are you really do you have the right metrics and the KPIs that you're using to measure, right? What are the policies that say that this definition change needs to go through a certain set of review before it gets approved, if there is a change in the way you're going to calculate a certain metric or a number. So it's not, there is no more room to be sort of open-ended on that or ad hoc. It's becoming definitely more prescriptive. And that transformation we're seeing across the board, driven by these factors, right? And so then I guess the technology part, which we come to next, is what enables making or sort of allowing that process change to be actually, I guess, implemented or executed, right? So I'll let you talk through these, Donald, as well. But, I think these
for sure.
Go ahead.
Well, in some ways, I mean, the slide is almost self-explanatory, because these three things are, very, very compelling.
Right.
At some point, the scalability. But let's think of scalability in different dimensions of scalability, because there's scalability just in terms of the sheer number of artifacts that you have to manage, for example, or the sheer amount of data that you have to manage. That imposes its own its own barriers or its own challenges. But there's also when you have a certain number of people as well. I think that that scalability in any sense are just too much for one person to manage. At that point, so that becomes really important. There's also a kind of point which scalability becomes its own threat as well. because people want more. You become in security terms, you talk about it in the surface area of the threat. That the more surface area is, the more likely something is to be attacked, or more vulnerable it is to attack. So scalability is a big part of that. I think something similar applies to the highly distributed scenarios as well. That's also a question of surface area, but it's also a question of scalability. The more distributed something is, the more difficult it is to manage. And then there's the sort of case of self-governance, which some tech is too difficult for one person to manage. It's too difficult for one person to have insight and oversight over. I mentioned earlier that we're heading towards an AI world, and this is absolutely going to be the case. So the possibility of trying to govern the complexity of an AI system, I think it's going to be a real challenge. People need tools to help them do that.
Yep. I mean, I think just it all goes back to the transformational aspect of how business is changing, right? And so us having to have the tools and the boundaries in how we work, it's defining how we work almost, right? Changing the way we work.
It is, and I think that's actually really important. All our talk about governance, people might hear this as a talk about a kind of tax that has to be paid. Oh, we're doing all this work and now we have to govern it. Oh dear, it's an extra cost, and it doesn't do anything except keep us legit. And that seems to me the negative view of governance. There's another view of this. A business that is well governed is actually able to free people up to do new work. And in particular, there's this idea that, yes, we can do what we're doing today better. We can do it with more freedom, more insight, but there's also the possibility of doing it differently. New business models, new practices, new processes, all of which we're going to be thrown into whether we want it or not over the next few years, with technological developments, sociological developments that'll come out of that. So we need to be ready for that. And governance is actually an enabler of those things. Being well governed enables you to innovate and to experiment with new practices with confidence, because you're well governed. And the fear of failure is to a certain extent taken away from that, because governance enables you to have insight and oversight of those processes.
Yeah, so I mean, I can talk about how we actually do that. And there are a lot of ways in which we have just discussed, right, the value of governance, right? And it's not about the negative connotation that sometimes governance has, because it's like you said, it's like everyone feels it's a tax or it's a burden. But if you look at it in terms of how it empowers the practice of decision making, so our goal is, facilitating that implementation of the process and the policies and the procedures, and providing that value, right? So getting the value out of your analytics investments and making sure that we're ready for this transformation, and that organizations are ready for the transformation around managing their, it's not just the data. The data ultimately translates into these analytics assets, whether those are reports or spreadsheets or dashboards, right? Or it could be AI models in the future. What do you need to do, and how do you need to do it to make sure that you are really sort of moving along the spectrum of change and sort of transformation and innovation? We do this in a couple of ways. I'm going to just touch upon these, and if anyone would like more information, happy to go through more detail in depth via a live demo. So please feel free to reach out. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. We look at our KPI repository as really the way to drive, business value in terms of how do you focus on the right KPIs and the right metrics when you're trying to sort of embark on that decision-making journey, where you have trust and confidence that you're looking at the information that has been certified, that has been vetted. You know who the business owner is. You know what the KPI definition is. Who is the steward around that KPI definition? And can you get this information right off the bat? So there is a way in which you're enabling, and this is usually a top-down sort of perspective, where executives nowadays are really looking to manage their business starting from the KPIs. we're talking to customers where, the management and the executive staff wants to only run their business and their ops review meetings using or starting the conversation from a KPI. No PowerPoints, no reports. Tell me how you're doing. Let's dive into, if you're not doing well or you're not trending, let's look at, the catalog and let's go figure out why. Let's go find the related reports. Let's go look at, why is this, what metric within the KPI is really driving the trend downward rather than, upward per the goal, right? So really using the platform to do, to run the business, so to speak. Now, report governance is sort of added on top of that, right? So you're governing your KPIs, but you've also got to govern the reports that those KPIs exist in. So how do you do that, right? You've got to take it through a governance workflow. And the benefit of a governance workflow, the way we look at it, is that it is different per organization. There is no one way that says that there should be 2 people or there should be 3 people or only IT should approve this or only business should approve it. It is absolutely a combination. And sometimes it is only one. So, and there are different levels of governance, right? There could be a report that is enterprise certified, and then there could be a report that is purely business certified and or department certified. So levels of governance, the workflow around governance, that is all what we look at in context of the report governance capabilities, right? And how we enable not just the executives, but their staff, right, to enable that entire confidence, the process and how decisions are being made, right? So it's more about that journey and that process. The next 2 are more aligned with where IT, right, really can benefit from an analytics governance platform and a framework where they have direct insight and oversight. I love that, by the way, insight and oversight, right? It's fantastic. So insight and oversight into the usage data, the statistics, driving rationalization and optimization. It's a continuous process of, it's not a one and done. It's a continuous process of report lifecycle management and or report optimization and governance, because as the business grows, you're going to want to measure new things. And you've got to keep evolving the definition of those new things, which means new reports, which means that the older reports may need to be retired, which means that the older definitions may need to be updated. How do you know that you need to do that? You only know that if you can actually have some place to go and understand what all exists. So typically, people don't have that visibility. And so what they're doing is they're just creating net new, and you're building up this swamp, right? But now you've got a way to sort of say, okay, let me monitor, let me manage, let me govern, so that nobody goes and uses an older KPI definition and nobody goes and uses an older report. So ultimately, we're facilitating that transformational change in enabling analytics governance, people, process, technology. So Julie, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right. I feel like we could talk on and on about this.
We could.
Every time we have these conversations, I enjoy them more and more, and I hope our audience has enjoyed this as well. Donald and Heena, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for sharing your perspectives, observations, and experience with us. Again, if you want to access if you in the audience want to access any of our previous Zen Talks, both with Donald Farmer and with other industry experts, you can go to the link that's on the screen at the moment and access those as well. But in the meantime, I do hope that you'll register for our upcoming event on January 9th. And I want to thank you all for attending today. It's been our pleasure, and we hope that it was yours as well. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.